What's the location of your emergency?
I just killed my sister. Oh my God.
Tell me what your name is.
Benjamin Elliott.
In the early morning darkness of September 29, 2021. 4:41 a.m. Harris County, Texas, a 17-year-old boy made a call that would shatter his family and challenge everything we think we know about consciousness, guilt, and the human mind. The question that would consume investigators, sleep experts, prosecutors, and eventually a jury: can someone commit murder while completely asleep? Or was this calculated, deliberate act disguised as a nightmare? This is the story of Benjamin Elliott, the boy who killed his twin, and why. Welcome to Veil of Crime HQ. To understand what happened that night, we need to go back to the beginning.
Okay, tell me exactly what happened.
I thought it was a dream. I took my knife and I stabbed her. Please, I don't want her to die. I'm sorry.
How old is she?
17, we're twins.
Is she awake?
Yes, she's like barely alive.
Is there anyone else there in the house with you?
There is, it's my parents, but they're asleep.
Okay, I need you to go wake them up.
Mom! Dad!
We're gonna have to start CPR right now. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2. Keep cupping her chest, just like that, okay?
Where's your son? Where's your son? Okay, we got it. EMS is coming.
Okay, slow down a little bit. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Benjamin and Megan Elliott weren't just siblings, they were twins, born minutes apart on the same day in 2004, connected in ways most people could never fully understand. From their first breath, they shared everything: a room, toys, secrets, dreams. They were two halves of the same whole. The Elliott family seemed ordinary in every way. Michael Elliott, a devoted stay-at-home dad who loved camping, knives, and outdoor gear. Kathy Elliott, a senior manager with the Girl Scouts of America, organized, caring, deeply committed to her children. Their oldest daughter, Elizabeth, had already left for college, leaving the twins to navigate their final year of high school together. But Megan was different in one important way. As a teenager, she'd been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. It made social situations difficult, made her sensitive, introspective, sometimes withdrawn. While other teenagers were out at parties and football games, Megan stayed home, finding solace in her art. She expressed herself through poetry and drawing, building a small but loyal following on YouTube where she shared her creative work. Friends and family watched as something beautiful began to happen in the months before her death. Megan was finally finding her voice. And Benjamin? He was her protector. Always had been. Friends describe a young man who was soft-spoken, brilliant, a bit nerdy, obsessed with engineering and science. He was the kind of brother who walked beside his sister in crowded hallways, who stood close when she felt uncomfortable, who made sure she was never alone. He was proud of that role. He loved being needed. According to everyone who knew them, there was no rivalry, no resentment, no hidden darkness between these twins. They were best friends. Megan looked up to Benjamin. Benjamin would do anything for Megan. That's what made what happened next so impossible to comprehend. The night of September 28, 2021, began like countless others in the Elliott household. It was a Wednesday. School was in session. The twins had classes the next day. Benjamin had been studying for the SAT, scheduled for that weekend. He had dreams of becoming a mechanical engineer, dreams that were finally within reach. That evening, Benjamin and his father spent hours gaming together, playing Survive the Nights, a popular zombie survival video game where players fight to stay alive against waves of undead enemies. During the game, Benjamin noticed something, a military-style knife that one of the characters carried. He mentioned to his father that it looked cool, reminded him of the survival gear they used on camping trips. Michael Elliott knew exactly what his son was talking about. He owned a knife just like it, an Air Force survival knife, 7 inches of stainless steel with a serrated edge, The kind of blade designed for extreme situations. A tool. A weapon. He went to get it and gave it to Benjamin that night. A gift from father to son. Michael Elliott would later say that if he had not given his son that knife, none of this would have happened. That decision, made in an innocent moment of father-son bonding, would haunt him forever. The family went to bed around their usual time, somewhere between 10 and 11 p.m. Megan retreated to her room down the hall. Benjamin went to his room, placed the new knife on his bedside table, and climbed into bed. Their parents, Michael and Kathy, exhausted from the day, fell asleep in their own bedroom. Everything was normal. Everything was fine. The house was quiet, peaceful, safe. But Benjamin Elliott didn't go to sleep right away. Phone records would later show that he was on his device, scrolling the web, looking at random content the way millions of teenagers do every night. YouTube videos, articles, nothing unusual, nothing disturbing. The last activity on his phone was recorded at 4:17 a.m. Benjamin would later tell investigators he thought he fell asleep somewhere around 2:30 or 3:30 in the morning, though he couldn't be sure. What happened in those next 24 minutes would change everything. At 4:41 a.m., Benjamin Elliott called 911. He was whispering, his voice barely audible, trembling with panic and confusion. "I just killed my sister." The 911 operator, trained to handle emergencies with calm professionalism, immediately began asking questions. "What's your name? What happened? How old is she? I thought it was a dream. I took my knife and I stabbed her. Please, I don't want her to die. She's 17. We're twins. Is she awake? Yes, she's barely alive." The operator instructed Benjamin to wake his parents, to start CPR immediately. Benjamin put the phone down and ran to his parents' room, calling out in the darkness. "Mom. Dad." Kathy and Michael Elliott jolted awake to find their son standing in their doorway, panic etched across his face. "It was a dream," he kept saying. "It was a dream." Michael Elliott would later describe the moment he entered Megan's room. His daughter was lying in her bed, gray, unresponsive, blood soaking through her clothing. He couldn't comprehend what he was seeing. His mind couldn't process it. He started CPR, pressing down on her chest, counting out loud, 1 2 3 4, 1 2 3 4, following the operator's instructions while his world collapsed around him. Kathy Elliott heard her husband yell, "Oh my God." She was trying to figure out what was happening, trying to make sense of the chaos. Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder, closer. When the paramedics arrived, they took over CPR from Michael. They moved Benjamin outside into the rain, handcuffed him, placed him in the back of a police car. He sat there, soaking wet, in shock, asking the same question over and over, "Is she okay? Is my sister okay?" Michael and Kathy stood in their driveway in their pajamas as their home became a crime scene. Yellow tape went up. Officers moved in and out, taking photos, collecting evidence. No one would tell them what was happening with Megan. No one would answer their questions. They called a longtime friend who was also an attorney. He went to the scene, spoke with officers, and came back with news that no parent should ever have to hear: Megan had died. But police didn't tell Benjamin. Not yet. They had questions first. Before we continue with what happened in that interrogation room, I need to ask you something. If you're watching this story unfold and you're feeling the weight of it, the tragedy of what happened to this family, take a moment right now to hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Share this video with someone you care about. True crime isn't just about entertainment, it's about awareness, about understanding the darkness that can enter our lives when we least expect it. Your engagement helps stories like this reach people who need to hear them. Now, let's get back to Benjamin Elliott and the interrogation that would determine his fate. Detective Frieder Munoz sat across from 17-year-old Benjamin Elliott in an interrogation room at the Harris County Sheriff's Office. It was now mid-morning, hours after the stabbing. Benjamin had been sitting in that police car for 3 hours, handcuffed, wet, alone with his thoughts. He had no lawyer. His parents weren't with him. He was just a kid who had woken up to a nightmare. Munoz started with basic questions. What happened, Benjamin? Tell me everything you remember. Benjamin's story was fragmented, confused, like trying to remember a dream that's already fading. He told Munoz that he'd been scrolling on his phone, that he'd eventually fallen asleep. The next thing he remembered was a feeling, the sensation of stabbing something. Not seeing it, not making a conscious decision, just the physical feeling of resistance, of a blade pushing through flesh. You ever have a really realistic nightmare where everything feels real, but also off at the same time? Benjamin asked the detective. That's what it felt like, he said. Like reality and dream had merged into something terrifying and confusing. He remembered turning on the light in Megan's room. He remembered seeing her, seeing the blood, the panic flooding through him. He grabbed a pillow and tried to stop the bleeding, pressing it against her neck. Then he ran to his room, unplugged his phone, and dialed 911. How many times did you stab her? Munoz asked. Just once, Benjamin said. But that wasn't true. The autopsy would later reveal that Megan Elliott had 2 stab wounds, not one. One was 4 inches deep, severing her carotid artery and jugular vein. She would have bled out within minutes. The second wound was also in her neck area. 2 deliberate strikes, not one. Did Benjamin not remember the second stab? Was he lying? Or was his mind, still caught between sleep and waking, unable to piece together what had actually happened? Munoz continued questioning. He asked about Benjamin's relationship with Megan. Were they close? Any fights? Any problems? Benjamin insisted they were close. She's my twin sister. I'd do anything for her. We're pretty close for siblings. No rivalry, no recent arguments, nothing that would explain why he would want to hurt her. The detective asked about mental health. Had Benjamin ever been diagnosed with anything? Depression? Anxiety? Psychosis? No, Benjamin said. He seemed calm in the interrogation, almost too calm for someone who had just learned he'd stabbed his sister. He answered questions methodically, provided his iPhone password without hesitation, gave permission for police to search his phone. He talked about his plans for the future, mechanical engineering, the SAT he was supposed to take that Saturday, college applications. And then, at one point, Benjamin said something that would later become a focal point for prosecutors. When asked where his phone was, Benjamin responded, somewhere at the crime scene. The crime scene. Not my house. Not my room. The crime scene. For prosecutors, this was significant. What 17-year-old refers to their own home as a crime scene unless they're fully aware of what they've done? 2 hours into the interrogation, Detective Munoz finally told Benjamin the truth. I'm sorry to tell you this, but Megan has succumbed to her injuries. Megan did not make it. Benjamin's response was immediate, I deserve that. Then he started to cry. But even his tears would later be analyzed, dissected, questioned. Were they real? Was this genuine grief, or was this performance? Was Benjamin Elliott a confused kid who had just woken up from a nightmare to discover he'd killed his sister? Or was he a cold-blooded murderer who had already started crafting his defense? The evidence police collected that morning painted a disturbing picture. The knife Benjamin had used was found at the scene, covered in Megan's blood. Benjamin's clothes were also soaked in blood. But there was something strange about the crime scene that investigators noticed immediately. There was very little blood spatter on the walls or floor around Megan's bed. When someone is stabbed in the neck, especially when a major artery is severed, blood sprays. It's violent, chaotic, impossible to contain. But in Megan's room, the blood was mostly contained to her body and the bedding. Why? Benjamin had told police he'd used a pillow to try to stop the bleeding. He'd pressed it against her neck, trying to save her. But prosecutors would later argue that the pillow served a different purpose, to muffle any sounds Megan might have made, to prevent blood from spraying across the room, to control the scene. There was another detail that troubled investigators. Benjamin had whispered during the 911 call. His parents' bedroom was just down the hall, yet he'd called 911 first, speaking in hushed tones, before waking them up. Why? If you've just accidentally hurt someone you love, wouldn't your first instinct be to scream for help? To wake your parents immediately? Prosecutors would argue that Benjamin whispered because he didn't want his parents to discover what he'd done before he'd had time to construct his story. That he called 911 first to establish a timeline, to create the appearance of someone trying to get help when, in reality, Megan was likely already dead. Within days, Benjamin Elliott was charged with the murder of his twin sister. He was placed on suicide watch. Standard procedure for someone who had just killed a family member and expressed remorse. After several days, he was released on bail. His parents were waiting for him outside the jail. When Michael saw his son standing on the sidewalk, he barely recognized him. Benjamin seemed lost, disconnected, like he didn't even see his father standing right in front of him. They got in the car and started driving, asking Benjamin if he was okay, getting only quiet, one-word answers. Michael pulled the car over, got out, walked around to Benjamin, and took his face in his hands. "Hi," he said. "We love you." "Hi." And Benjamin finally seemed to wake up, to realize where he was, who he was with. He hugged his parents and broke down crying. The Elliots knew they could never sleep in their home again. The house where they'd raised their children, where Megan had died, where everything had fallen apart, it was a crime scene now, a place of horror. They moved in with Kathy's mother. But even in a new place, safety felt impossible. Benjamin was terrified of himself. He was worried he might sleepwalk again, might do something else without realizing it. He wanted to make sure everybody was safe. So Michael and Kathy took precautions. Michael slept in a chair in front of Benjamin's door for the first 2 nights. They installed an alarm on his door that would go off if he tried to leave his room at night. They watched him constantly, afraid to close their eyes, afraid of what might happen in the darkness. And the question that haunted them, the question they weren't allowed to ask their son because his attorneys had advised against it, burned in their minds every single day: why? Why had this happened? Michael and Kathy knew their son. They'd raised him, watched him grow, celebrated his kindness and intelligence and compassion. There had never been anything wrong with him. No warning signs, no red flags, no history of violence or anger or mental instability. But Kathy's father had been schizophrenic. She now feared that her son might be suffering from the same illness, that a psychotic break had caused him to attack his sister without understanding what he was doing. Benjamin's defense attorneys, Wes Rucker and Carrie Hart, had the same concern. They immediately brought in a psychiatrist to evaluate Benjamin, expecting her to diagnose schizophrenia or severe bipolar disorder, something that would explain the inexplicable. But when the psychiatrist called Wes Rucker back with her assessment, she had shocking news: "Wes, he's fine." Benjamin Elliott was not schizophrenic. He was not bipolar. He had no diagnosable mental illness that would explain why he had stabbed his sister. Psychologically, he was a normal, healthy 17-year-old kid. So if mental illness wasn't the answer, what was? The defense team began digging deeper, looking for any explanation that made sense. And that's when they stumbled upon something that would become the cornerstone of their entire case: sleepwalking. Benjamin had told Detective Munoz that stabbing Megan felt like a dream. What if it wasn't just a figure of speech? What if he had literally been asleep when it happened? I want to pause here for a moment and ask you something. Where are you watching this from right now? Drop your location in the comments below. And if you've made it this far into this story, if you're still following along, comment "I'm still here" so I can see who's truly invested in understanding what happened to Benjamin and Megan Elliott. The next part of this story gets even more complex, even more disturbing. Let's continue. Sleepwalking, known medically as somnambulism, is more common than most people realize. Studies suggest that up to 4% of adults and 17% of children experience sleepwalking episodes at some point in their lives. For most, it's harmless, walking around the house, mumbling incoherently, maybe raiding the refrigerator before returning to bed with no memory of what happened. But in rare cases, sleepwalking can turn violent. There are documented cases throughout history of people committing serious crimes while allegedly asleep, and some of them have walked free. In 1987, a Canadian man named Kenneth Parks drove his car 14 miles to his in-laws' home in the middle of the night, beat his mother-in-law to death with a tire iron, and stabbed his father-in-law. He claimed he'd been asleep the entire time, that he had no memory of the attack, that he would never have harmed them while conscious. A jury believed him and found him not guilty. In 2010, a North Carolina man named Joseph Mitchell strangled his 4-year-old son to death and attacked 2 of his other children while allegedly sleepwalking. He too was acquitted, with the jury accepting that he had no control over his actions. Could the same thing have happened to Benjamin Elliott? Could he have walked into his sister's room, grabbed the knife from his bedside table, and stabbed her twice without ever waking up? Benjamin's attorneys reached out to Dr. Gerald Simmons, a neurologist and sleep disorder specialist who had spent decades studying parasomnias, abnormal behaviors that occur during sleep. When Simmons first heard about the case, his reaction was skepticism. He'd seen defendants try to fake sleepwalking before, had testified in cases where the science simply didn't support the claim. His first thought was, is this even worth my time? But Simmons is one of the leading experts in his field. If anyone was going to evaluate whether Benjamin Elliott had truly been sleepwalking, it would have to be him. He agreed to take the case. The first thing Simmons wanted to know was whether Benjamin had any history of sleepwalking. The answer was yes. When Benjamin was about 10 years old, his older sister Elizabeth had found him sleepwalking outside her bedroom door in the middle of the night. He was just standing there, staring, unresponsive. When she woke him up, he was confused and had no memory of how he'd gotten there. There was also an incident at a childhood sleepover. Benjamin's friends had found him asleep on a couch, eating a donut. When they woke him, he seemed genuinely shocked and confused, asking how the donut had gotten in his hand. These weren't dramatic incidents, but they established a pattern. Benjamin had sleepwalked before. Dr. Simmons also learned something crucial: sleepwalking ran in the Elliott family. Kathy's uncle had been a sleepwalker as a teenager, walking out to the garage in the middle of the night and using power tools with no memory of it the next morning. He'd once walked into Kathy's mother's bathroom while she was showering, completely asleep. Kathy's aunt had an even more frightening experience. She'd walked out of her house in the middle of the night, wandered into the woods, and woken up during a thunderstorm, soaking wet and disoriented, with no idea how she'd gotten there. From a genetic standpoint, this was significant. Research shows that sleepwalking has a strong hereditary component. If you have close family members who sleepwalk, your risk of experiencing it yourself is significantly higher. Dr. Simmons decided to conduct formal sleep studies with Benjamin. He brought him into his sleep lab on 2 separate occasions, 6 weeks apart, and hooked him up to machines that would monitor everything: brain waves, heart rate, breathing patterns, muscle movements, eye movements. Every tiny detail of Benjamin's sleep would be recorded and analyzed. What Simmons discovered was remarkable. First, Benjamin had obstructive sleep apnea. This meant that while he slept, his airway would occasionally become partially blocked, disrupting his breathing and causing disturbances in his sleep pattern. These disruptions could serve as triggers for sleepwalking episodes, especially when combined with other factors like stress, exhaustion, or irregular sleep schedules. Second, Benjamin entered deep, slow-wave sleep extraordinarily quickly. In the sleep study, it took just 11 minutes from the time the lights went out for Benjamin to enter this deepest stage of non-REM sleep. Most people take 30 to 45 minutes or longer. This was crucial because sleepwalking typically occurs during non-REM slow-wave sleep. It's the stage where your body is most deeply at rest, where your conscious mind is least active, where the normal inhibitions that prevent you from acting out dreams or impulses are at their weakest. Now, here's where the timeline becomes critical. On the night Benjamin stabbed Megan, his phone activity stopped at 4:17 a.m. He called 911 at 4:41 a.m. That's just 24 minutes, barely enough time for most people to even fall asleep, let alone enter deep sleep and experience a sleepwalking episode. But Benjamin wasn't most people. Dr. Simmons had proven that Benjamin could reach slow-wave sleep in as little as 11 minutes. 24 minutes was more than enough time for him to fall asleep, enter the deepest stage of sleep, experience a parasomnia episode, and attack his sister while completely unconscious. Dr. Simmons reviewed the case files, the 911 call, the police interrogation, the autopsy reports. And he came to a conclusion that would become the foundation of Benjamin's defense. I believe it was part of a parasomnia. He didn't do this voluntarily. There was no motivation. Ben definitely killed his sister, there's no question. He's the one that had the knife and he stabbed her. But I believe he was asleep when it happened. For Benjamin's parents, this was both a relief and a terror. A relief because it meant their son wasn't a murderer in the traditional sense, wasn't someone who had consciously chosen to kill his sister. But a terror because it meant something even more disturbing. That any of us, under the right circumstances, could commit an act of violence while asleep and have absolutely no control over it. It's scary as hell, Michael Elliott said. If that can happen to us, then that could happen to anybody with a sleep problem. The Elliots believed that with Dr. Simmons' findings, prosecutors might drop the case. After all, if Benjamin truly had been sleepwalking, how could he be held criminally responsible? How can you prosecute someone for something they did while unconscious? But in April 2023, a year and a half after Megan's death, a grand jury indicted Benjamin Elliott on charges of first-degree murder. He was 19 years old now, no longer a child in the eyes of the law. And prosecutors were determined to prove that what happened to Megan Elliott had nothing to do with sleepwalking and everything to do with calculated, deliberate murder. Megan Long and Maroon Kotani were the prosecutors assigned to the case. For them, the sleepwalking defense was nothing more than a convenient excuse, a way for Benjamin Elliott to escape responsibility for what he'd done. Megan Long was particularly skeptical. This wasn't her first sleepwalking case. In 2019, she'd successfully convicted a man who claimed he'd been sleepwalking when he shot and killed his wife. Long herself was a sleepwalker, as were her children, so she understood the phenomenon intimately. And everything about Benjamin Elliott's case felt wrong to her. The prosecution hired their own sleep expert, Dr. Mark Pressman, a psychologist who specialized in sleep disorders. After reviewing the case files, though notably, without ever speaking to Benjamin directly, Pressman came to the opposite conclusion of Dr. Simmons. Benjamin Elliott was not sleepwalking when he stabbed his sister. Pressman pointed out several key factors that contradicted the sleepwalking theory. First, when sleepwalkers become violent, it's typically a reflexive response to being physically interfered with. Someone tries to wake them or restrain them, and they lash out instinctively, hitting, kicking, throwing objects. But they don't plan attacks. They don't grab weapons. They don't target specific people in calculated ways. Benjamin, however, would have had to get out of bed, pick up the knife from his bedside table, unsheath it, a complex, conscious action, walk down the hallway to Megan's room, enter her room, and stab her twice in the neck. For Pressman, this sequence of actions was far too deliberate, too purposeful to have been done while asleep. Second, Benjamin had memories of the stabbing. He told police he remembered the feeling of the knife going into flesh, remembered turning on the light, remembered trying to stop the bleeding with a pillow. Pressman argued that sleepwalkers don't form memories during episodes. They might have fragmentary recall, fleeting images, but not detailed, sequential memories like Benjamin described. Dr. Simmons disagreed with this assessment, arguing that Benjamin's memories were exactly what you'd expect from someone transitioning between sleep and wakefulness. He wasn't claiming to remember everything, just sensory fragments, emotional impressions. If he were fabricating the story, Simmons argued, it would have been easier for Benjamin to simply claim he remembered nothing at all. But Pressman felt he'd seen enough. Even without interviewing Benjamin, he was confident in his conclusion. This was not a sleepwalking case. The prosecution knew that without a clear motive, their case would be challenging. No one, not friends, not family, not teachers, not even investigators who'd combed through Benjamin's digital life, could find any evidence of problems between the twins. No arguments, no jealousy, no resentment, no history of violence. The biggest thing they were hanging their hat on was the lack of motive, prosecutors acknowledged. But they believed they could convince a jury that the absence of a clear reason didn't mean Benjamin was innocent, it just meant his motive was hidden, or that the opportunity had simply presented itself and he'd taken it. They focused on the physical evidence. 2 stab wounds, not one. The lack of blood spatter on the walls, which they argued meant the pillow had been used to control the scene, not to save Megan's life. The whispered 911 call, suggesting Benjamin didn't want his parents to wake up and discover what he'd done before he was ready. The calm demeanor during the interrogation, the strange reference to the crime scene, the fact that Megan was likely already dead by the time paramedics arrived. And there was something else. During the interrogation, Benjamin had mentioned that Megan had struggled with severe depression. To prosecutors, this suggested that maybe everything wasn't as perfect in the Elliott household as everyone claimed. Maybe there were tensions no one wanted to talk about. Benjamin's attorneys found this argument absurd. They pointed out that investigators had made virtually no effort to actually learn about Benjamin or his family. They hadn't interviewed his friends extensively, hadn't talked to teachers, hadn't looked into his character beyond surface-level background checks. They'd simply assumed guilt and worked backward to fit the evidence to their theory. They don't have a clue about this kid, Wes Rucker said. He would know what was going to happen to him if he killed his sister. There was nothing for him to gain. There was everything for him to lose. There's just no reason why he would have done that. Before trial, prosecutors offered Benjamin a plea deal, 30 years in prison. He would be eligible for parole eventually, would still have most of his life ahead of him when he was released. Benjamin turned it down. He refused to plead guilty to murdering his sister when he genuinely believed he'd been asleep when it happened. For him, accepting that deal would mean admitting to something he hadn't consciously done, living with a lie for the rest of his life. The Elliott family now faced their worst nightmare. They'd already lost Megan. Now they might lose Benjamin too. Not to death, but to a prison cell, to decades behind bars, to a life destroyed. The tragedy is, Carrie Hart said, the family lost their daughter, but they're now losing their son. He's on trial for his life. If this story is affecting you, if you're thinking about the impossible situation this family found themselves in, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button right now if you haven't already. Like this video. Share it with someone who needs to understand how quickly life can change, how tragedy can strike even the most ordinary families. Your support helps these stories reach the people who need to hear them. It helps protect others from similar tragedies by raising awareness. Now, let's go to the courtroom where Benjamin Elliott's fate would be decided. On February 18, 2025, Benjamin Elliott's first-degree murder trial began. He sat at the defense table, now 20 years old, wearing a suit, looking more like a college student than a killer. His parents sat behind him in the gallery, their faces drawn with exhaustion and grief. The prosecution's opening statement was direct and unflinching. Maroon Katani told the jury about the 911 call, playing the audio for them to hear Benjamin's whispered voice, "I just killed my sister." He walked them through the timeline, the evidence, the 2 stab wounds that contradicted Benjamin's claim that he'd only stabbed Megan once. He emphasized Benjamin's calm demeanor during the interrogation, his strange reference to the crime scene, his lack of visible distress when told his sister was dead. He realized what he'd done, Katani argued. And he knew he needed an explanation. So he claimed it was a dream. The prosecution called witness after witness. Medical examiners described Megan's injuries in clinical detail. The 4-inch deep wound that severed her carotid artery and jugular vein. The rapid blood loss. The fact that she would have been dead within minutes of the attack. Forensic experts testified about the crime scene, the lack of blood spatter, the controlled nature of the killing. They suggested that the pillow Benjamin claimed he'd used to stop the bleeding had actually been used to muffle any sounds Megan might have made, to prevent blood from spraying across the room. Michael Elliott was called to the stand and asked to identify a photograph from Megan's autopsy. It was a moment of pure agony, a father forced to look at images of his deceased daughter's body and confirm for the record, yes, that's Megan. The prosecution's strategy was clear. Even without a motive, they had a confession, physical evidence, and expert testimony that contradicted the sleepwalking defense. They wanted the jury to believe that Benjamin Elliott had deliberately murdered his sister and then crafted an elaborate story to escape punishment. When the defense's turn came, Wes Rucker and Carrie Hart knew they had an uphill battle. They needed to convince 12 strangers that something most people had never experienced, violent sleepwalking, was not only real but was exactly what had happened that night. "This is not a ruse," Carrie Hart told the jury in his opening statement. "This is not some defense to get Ben off of a tragic set of circumstances. This is a real phenomenon. Sleepwalking is real. Violent parasomnias are real. And that's what happened to Benjamin Elliott." They called family friends who testified about Benjamin's character, his devotion to Megan, his role as her protector. Drew Whitaker told the jury she'd never seen Benjamin act violently or change into someone else. He was the same sweet, caring kid he'd always been. Childhood friend Anand Singh appeared via Zoom and described the sleepover where he'd found Benjamin asleep, eating a donut, completely confused about how it had gotten into his hand. Benjamin's great-aunt, Martha Knight Oakley, a psychologist, testified about her own terrifying sleepwalking experience. Waking up in the woods during a thunderstorm, clutching her dog, with no memory of leaving her house. But the star witness, the person everything hinged on, was Dr. Gerald Simmons. He spent 4 hours on the stand, explaining in meticulous detail the science of sleep, the nature of parasomnias, the specific findings from Benjamin's sleep studies. He showed the jury brainwave patterns, explained the significance of Benjamin's obstructive sleep apnea, demonstrated how quickly Benjamin could enter deep sleep. He walked them through the timeline, showing how it was physiologically possible for Benjamin to have fallen asleep at 4:17 a.m. and been in the midst of a sleepwalking episode by 4:41 a.m. "It totally fits in line with the process we call sleepwalking violent behaviors," Simmons testified. "Every element of this case is consistent with what we know about parasomnias." The prosecution's rebuttal was swift. They called Dr. Mark Pressman, who testified that Benjamin was not in a sleepwalking state when he killed Megan. "How did you come to that conclusion?" the prosecutor asked. "He had memory," Pressman said. "He came out of the state much faster than any sleepwalker could." The complexity of his actions. Unsheathing the knife, walking to another room, targeting a specific person with multiple stab wounds, all of this is inconsistent with sleepwalking. The courtroom was divided. Half the people in that room were probably thinking, "This is a tragedy, a medical phenomenon, something that could happen to anyone." The other half were thinking, "This is murder, plain and simple, and he's trying to get away with it." In closing arguments, the prosecution hammered their case home with precision and passion. Maroon Katani stood before the jury, holding up the Air Force survival knife, the weapon that had ended Megan Elliott's life. "Benjamin Elliott walked into his sister's room with this very knife," Katani said, his voice steady and unwavering. "And he stabbed her. Not once, but twice. In the neck. He knew what he was doing. He knew the consequences. And when he realized he couldn't hide what he'd done, he called 911 and claimed it was a dream." Katani reminded the jury of the whispered 911 call, the lack of blood spatter, the calm demeanor during interrogation, the reference to the crime scene. He urged them not to be swayed by sympathetic testimony or complex sleep science. The facts, he argued, were simple: Benjamin Elliott killed his sister, and he needed to be held accountable. The defendant wants you to believe this was beyond his control, Kotani continued. But everything about this case, the evidence, the timeline, his behavior, tells a different story. This was deliberate. This was intentional. This was murder. When it was the defense's turn, Wes Rucker approached the jury with a different tone entirely. He didn't deny that Benjamin had killed Megan. He couldn't. The evidence was irrefutable. But he asked the jury to consider something that made them deeply uncomfortable. What if Benjamin truly had no control over his actions? Ladies and gentlemen, Ben Elliott is a victim too, Rucker said, his voice filled with emotion. He went to sleep that night like he'd done thousands of times before. And he woke up to discover he'd killed the person he loved most in the world. His twin sister. His best friend. His protector. Rucker walked the jury through Dr. Simmons' testimony, the sleep studies, the genetic history of sleepwalking in the family, the physiological evidence that made a parasomnia episode not just possible, but probable. The prosecution wants you to find a motive, Rucker continued. But there isn't one. They've looked everywhere. They've investigated every corner of Ben's life. And they've found nothing. Because there is nothing. No anger. No resentment. No jealousy. No violence in his past. No reason whatsoever for him to want his sister dead. He pointed to Benjamin, sitting at the defense table with his head bowed. Look at him, Rucker said. Does that look like a cold-blooded killer to you? Or does it look like a young man living with an unimaginable tragedy that wasn't his fault? Rucker reminded the jury of the 911 call, but he framed it differently than the prosecution had. Listen to his words again. I thought it was a dream. Please, I don't want her to die. He's trying to do CPR. He's desperate to save her. That's not the behavior of someone who wanted this to happen. That's the behavior of someone who's just realized the horrible truth of what occurred while he was asleep. The defense's closing argument was passionate, emotional, and grounded in science. But would it be enough? The jury deliberated for 3 days. 3 agonizing days where the Elliott family sat in that courthouse, waiting, praying, hoping that 12 strangers would see the truth of what had happened. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, word came, the jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled with tension as everyone took their seats. Benjamin sat between his attorneys, his parents directly behind him, their hands clasped together so tightly their knuckles had turned white. On the other side of the courtroom, the prosecution team sat ready, confident in their case. The jury filed in, their faces unreadable. The foreperson handed the verdict form to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. The judge reviewed it silently, his expression giving nothing away, then handed it back to the bailiff to read aloud. In the case of the state of Texas versus Benjamin Elliott, on the charge of first-degree murder, we the jury find the defendant. The pause felt eternal. Every person in that courtroom held their breath. Not guilty. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, sobs, shouts of disbelief from both sides. Michael and Kathy Elliott collapsed into each other's arms, crying tears of relief and anguish all at once. Benjamin dropped his head into his hands, his shoulders shaking. The jury had believed the sleepwalking defense. They'd concluded that while Benjamin had physically killed his sister, he had not done so with criminal intent. He had been asleep, unconscious, unaware of his actions. Under the law, he could not be held responsible for something he did while in that state. But acquittal didn't mean freedom. Not really. Benjamin Elliott would have to live with what he'd done for the rest of his life. He would wake up every morning knowing that his hands had taken his sister's life, even if his mind hadn't been present for it. That's a burden no verdict can erase. The prosecution, while disappointed, accepted the verdict. Megan Long gave a statement saying she respected the jury's decision but maintained that she believed Benjamin had been awake and aware during the stabbing. We presented our case based on the evidence, she said. The jury saw it differently, and that's their right. But perhaps the most haunting question remained unanswered: could this happen again? Not just to Benjamin, but to anyone? Dr. Simmons was asked this directly. If someone has a history of sleepwalking, if they have sleep apnea or other sleep disruptions, if there's a genetic component, then yes, under certain conditions, a violent parasomnia episode is possible. It's rare, extremely rare, but it can happen. Benjamin Elliott now lives under the shadow of that possibility every single day. He takes medication to manage his sleep apnea. He's undergone additional sleep studies and behavioral therapy. He has alarms installed in whatever home he stays in. He does everything possible to prevent another episode. But can you ever really be sure? Can you ever truly trust yourself again after something like this? The answer, for Benjamin, is no. He will spend the rest of his life second-guessing every moment of drowsiness, every vivid dream, every time he wakes up disoriented. The psychological trauma of knowing what he's capable of, even while unconscious, is something no therapy can fully heal. And the Elliott family will never be whole again. They lost Megan in the most horrific way imaginable. They almost lost Benjamin to the prison system. They lost their home, their sense of safety, their belief that their family was somehow protected from the worst tragedies life can offer. Michael Elliott still blames himself for giving Benjamin that knife. If I hadn't done that, he said multiple times, Megan would still be alive. That guilt will haunt him forever. Kathy Elliott has become an advocate for sleep disorder awareness, speaking to medical groups and parent organizations about the warning signs of dangerous parasomnias. She wants other families to understand the risks, to take sleepwalking seriously, to seek medical intervention before something terrible happens. Elizabeth Elliott, the older sister who had been away at college when everything fell apart, has had to navigate her own complex grief. She lost her sister. Her brother was accused of murder. Her family was torn apart by forces no one understood. She's had to rebuild relationships, reconcile conflicting emotions, and somehow find a way to forgive Benjamin for something he may not have had control over. And Benjamin? He's tried to move forward, though forward is a relative term when you're carrying this much weight. He never got to take that SAT he was studying for. His dreams of becoming a mechanical engineer are on hold, perhaps permanently. Some universities won't accept him, regardless of the verdict. Some jobs won't hire him once they learn his history. He lives with the knowledge that he killed his twin sister, his best friend, the person he was supposed to protect. And even though a jury said he wasn't criminally responsible, Benjamin knows the truth, his hands wielded that knife. His actions ended her life. Whether he was awake or asleep doesn't change the fact that Megan is gone. Friends who've stayed in contact say Benjamin rarely talks about that night. He can't. The memories, fragmentary as they are too painful, too confusing, too heavy to put into words. He's been diagnosed with PTSD, experiences nightmares and flashbacks, struggles with depression and anxiety. In one of his rare public statements, made during a victim impact hearing after the trial, Benjamin addressed Megan directly, even though she wasn't there to hear it. "Megan, I'm so sorry," he said, tears streaming down his face. "I would give anything to take back that night. I would trade places with you if I could. You were my sister, my twin, my best friend. And I took that away. I know saying sorry will never be enough. It will never bring you back. But I need you to know that I loved you. I love you still. And I will carry you with me every single day for the rest of my life." The courtroom was silent except for the sound of quiet crying. The story of Benjamin and Megan Elliott raises questions that don't have easy answers. Questions about consciousness and responsibility. Questions about how we define guilt when someone commits an act without awareness or intent. Questions about whether our legal system is equipped to handle cases like this, where science and morality collide in the most devastating way possible. Can you be a murderer if you don't know you're murdering? Can you be held accountable for actions taken while your conscious mind is offline? Where do we draw the line between "I didn't mean to" and "I couldn't have controlled it"? These are philosophical and legal questions that society will continue to grapple with as our understanding of the human brain evolves. Sleep science is still in its relative infancy. We're learning more every year about what happens when we close our eyes, about the strange liminal space between waking and dreaming, about the ways our brains can betray us. But for the Elliott family, these aren't abstract philosophical questions. They're the reality they live with every single day. Megan Elliott was 17 years old when she died. She was an artist, a poet, a young woman just beginning to find her voice in the world. She loved drawing, loved creating content for her YouTube channel, loved her family. She was on the autism spectrum, which made life harder sometimes, but she was figuring it out. She was finding her people, her purpose, her path. And in 24 minutes, all of that was taken away. Not by a stranger. Not by an enemy. But by her twin brother, in an act so senseless, so random, so beyond anyone's control that it almost defies comprehension. Some people will hear this story and believe Benjamin Elliott is a murderer who got away with it. They'll point to the evidence, the 2 stab wounds, the calm demeanor, and say that the sleepwalking defense was a convenient lie that a sympathetic jury bought. Others will hear this story and see a tragedy compounded by another tragedy. They'll believe that Benjamin was genuinely asleep, that he had no conscious intent, that he's as much a victim of circumstance as Megan was. The truth is, we may never know with absolute certainty what happened in Benjamin Elliott's mind during those 24 minutes between 4:17 a.m. and 4:41 a.m. on September 29, 2021. We can study brain waves and sleep patterns and genetic predispositions, but we can't crawl inside his consciousness and experience what he experienced. What we do know is this: 2 young people's lives ended that night. Megan's literally, and Benjamin's in every way that matters. 2 parents lost both of their youngest children in a single moment. A family was destroyed. And all of us are left wondering if something like this could happen to us, to someone we love, on an ordinary Wednesday night when we think we're safe in our beds. Because that's perhaps the most terrifying part of this entire story. The Elliots weren't special. They weren't cursed. They weren't living recklessly or ignoring warning signs. They were just an ordinary family, living an ordinary life, until the night everything changed. They were us. And what happened to them could happen to any of us. This is the story of Benjamin Elliott, the boy who killed his twin. It's a story without winners, without clear answers, without the kind of resolution that makes us feel safe and certain about the world. If this story has affected you, if it's made you think about consciousness, responsibility, family, tragedy, or the fragile nature of the lives we lead, I want to hear from you in the comments. What do you think happened that night? Do you believe Benjamin was truly asleep? Or do you think this was something else entirely? And here's what I want to ask you: what case should be covered next? Drop your suggestions in the comments below. Your voices matter. Your stories matter. This channel exists because you're here, engaging, thinking critically, and trying to understand the darkest corners of human experience. If this video opened your eyes to something you didn't know before, if it made you more aware of the warning signs of sleep disorders, if it made you think twice about the complexity of criminal justice, then please, share it. Share it with your friends, your family, anyone who needs to understand that tragedy can strike without warning, and that awareness might be the only protection we have. Like this video. Subscribe to this channel. Turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Because these aren't just stories, they're lessons, warnings, reminders that life is precious and fragile and can change in an instant. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring enough to make it all the way to the end. And remember, if you're struggling with sleep disorders, if you or someone you love has a history of sleepwalking, please seek medical help. Talk to a sleep specialist. Take it seriously. Because prevention is always better than tragedy. This is the story of Benjamin and Megan Elliott. May Megan rest in peace. And may Benjamin find whatever peace is possible for someone living with this burden. Until next time, stay safe. Stay aware. And take care of each other.